The fourth largest passenger group on board the Titanic were Swedes. Little over 100 Swedish passengers fought for the survival when RMS Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 34 of them survived. This video investigates the story of those passengers. Up in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotted the famous iceberg. The moonless condition made the lookout harder, and when Frederick saw it, he called the bridge and phrased the famous line, "Iceberg, right ahead." First officer on the bridge tries to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg, but unfortunately it strikes the ship on the starboard bow. At first glance they think they escaped the disaster and thought the iceberg nearly just scratched the hull. But as soon as 10 minutes later, Captain Smith got Thomas Andrews, the shipbuilder, who were on the maiden trip to survey the damage, and after some investigation he calculated that the Titanic was indeed sinkable, and it would happen in roughly 2 hours. Many of the passengers were asleep and didn't feel the glance at all. But after 11:40 p.m. the clock was ticking. Close to the bow, 3 Swedes shared a cabin in 3rd class. August Wennerström, Carl-Olof Jansson and Gunnar Tinglin. Many of the Swedes on board were in 3rd class and had boarded the ship at Southampton via Denmark or Gothenburg. Wennerström and Carl-Olof were both socialists and knew each other. Wennerström had years previously insulted the Swedish king, Oscar II, in a publication called Gula faran, the Yellow Danger, and he had felt that the authorities' interest in his activism was becoming too dangerous. So he boarded the Titanic under a false name and ended up with 2 other Swedes, Carl-Olof and Gunnar Tinglin. All 3 were sleeping when Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:49 p.m. Tinglin was dozing off, but felt, as he recalled it, quote, "a nudge," unquote, and woke him up. He got dressed and ventured topside with Wennerström, leaving his shoes and lifebelt behind. Carl-Olof joined them minutes later. He also awoken by the collision and hurried up to deck. He too was in such a hurry that he had forgotten to put on any shoes. While up on deck, they wanted to see the iceberg everybody was talking about, but they had just missed it. Only some ice fragment from the iceberg were left up on deck. At the same time, Agnes Sandström, also a 3rd class passenger, shared her cabin with Mrs. Elna Matilda Ström in the stern of J deck, cabin G6. Both families were heading to the United States, and Agnes was awake, talking with Elna after she had put her daughter to bed, when they both felt a bump. Quote, "As we sat there talking, there was a bump, something was hitting us. We couldn't understand that at first, but later on they came to tell us that the ship they had hit an iceberg, that there was a hole or something, but it would soon be fixed, and then we'd be under our way again," unquote. Minutes later, Elna's brother Ernst came inside their cabin and told them that he heard something and it was not right, and told them to get up. Agnes woke both her children up and gathered their belongings to venture up to the deck, accompanied by Elna Ström and her daughter. Up at sea deck, Gunnar Tinglin, Wennerström, Carl-Olof Jansson finds more bits of ice from the iceberg the Titanic had scratched off. They ask a passing Starline officer if there's any danger to the ship, but the officer just scoffs at them and tells them no, that they should just go back to bed. But instead of that they walk away and try to investigate for themselves, not knowing that the ship is already taking in waters. April 15, 1912. So, the 3 Swedes, according to the sources, were still on sea deck when they are witnessing a multicultural scene of confusing people from variety of countries in various stages of undress, with all types of luggage, in a state of disbelief. After a while, as more and more people are up on sea deck, they feel that Titanic is probably taking in water, or something terrible has happened. So Tengling, Karl Olof and Wennerström decides to return to their berth to get their life belts. Upon reaching the gangway, they are met with rushing waters and floats of crates, ice and coal. Karl Olof Jansson, quote, "Then I ran down to my cabin to bring my other clothes, watch and bag, but had only time to take the watch and the coat when water with enormous force came into the cabin, and I had to rush up to the deck again, where I found my friends standing with life belts on and with terror painted in their faces. What shall I do now, with no life belts and no shoes and no cap?" Unquote. On the way up they pass a steward on Scotland Road, the ship-long corridor on E-deck, trying frantically to talk to all the third-class passengers, but most of them don't understand English. He sees Tengling, who speaks good English, and asks him if he can be an interpreter. Tengling sees that his friends just want to go up. The panic is all over them. But he agrees due to the fact that many of them are Scandinavians. So the steward and Tengling attempts to convince the frightened passenger to go topside, but with little success. He leaves the steward soon after to find his mates again. Agnes and Elna and their party had begun the long walk up to the boat deck. She sees a steward ordering people in third class to put their life vests on and go up to the boat deck. Here, we can speculate that Agnes and Elna are crossing paths with Tengling right about now, but we can't be too sure. At this point, Agnes was struggling to keep everybody together, her family and the Ströms. But around 1 AM, Agnes finally made it to the boat deck, and she thought the Ströms were behind her. But when she turned around, they were all gone. She never saw them again. Agnes and her daughter were up on the boat deck and saw people everywhere in panic. She stated that there were ropes on the floor and she was so tired of trying to get up here, thinking she would never survive. As people were trying to get into the lifeboats, she just sat down on one of those ropes and said, quote, "I'm fed up. I can't do it any longer," unquote. But suddenly, their cabin steward was amongst the crowd and saw them. He told them to get onto the lifeboat, and he helped her and her daughter into lifeboat 13, one of the last to leave the sinking ship. Only lifeboat 4, 10, and the collapsible A to D were still on the ship. At the same time, both Wennerström, Tengling and the other Swedes, possible Karl Olof, are on the boat deck seeing lifeboat 13 and 15 being loaded with passengers. Tengling and the others can feel the boat sinking, and from the side of the deck he sees people jumping into the cold frigid waters. Here the sources differ about what happened with Tengling. One source stated that he watched the remaining lifeboats being loaded and then got into lifeboat 13 or 15. He can't really remember. He had first tried to enter one of the lifeboats, but then stepped out when a woman and a child stepped in. Then, finding that there was still room in the boat, he stepped into it and thus was saved. But in some other newspaper account, like Burlington Daily Gazette, Tengling claimed to be on the sinking Titanic till the end and got rescued by the passengers on collapsible A. This is the version I'm going with, due to the fact that he is stating a first-hand account to several newspapers later on that matches what Wennerström and Karl-Olof have stated. Either way, from this point on, he sees the almost catastrophic event when lifeboat number 13 was lowered away to the water and number 15 nearly came on top of it. But the disaster was avoided at the last second when someone found a knife to cut the ropes, allowing 13 to float away. At this point, he hears several shots fired, which is speculated to be Mr. Murdoch shooting either himself or up in the air, trying to thin out the crowds of panicking passengers. The discussion about if Mr. Murdoch shot himself or not is still debatable until this day. However, Tengling saw something from his own nightmares that night. A young third-class woman attempts to toss her baby into a lifeboat's passenger's outstretched arms, but she misses, and the baby drops into the Atlantic, upon which the mother screams and jumps in after her child. This tragic scene haunted him for the rest of his life. At 1:15 a.m, Tengling, Wennerström and Karl-Olof Jansson watch as the last wooden lifeboat, boat 4, from port side leaves the Titanic. Quote, "The lifeboats were all gone. It looked to us if we were doomed to perish with the ship." Unquote. Alma Paulsson and her 4 children were in 3rd class, and she wanted to join her husband Nils, who had immigrated to America already in 1910. She had earlier on the ship met fellow Swedes, August Wennerström, Karl-Olof Jansson, Edvard and Elin Lindell, and she got to know them very well. As she was taking the trip alone with her 4 children, the companionship of the Swedes were something she appreciated a lot. Her husband was working as a tram conductor in Chicago and was already waiting for them in the States. On this night, after the iceberg struck the Titanic, she was told to dress her 4 children with life jackets and go up on the boat deck. But this, however, took way too long for her, and she finally came up on the boat deck approximately 1:50 a.m. when every lifeboat was already in the water. She was devastated, but amongst the chaotic crowd she sees Wennerström and Karl-Olof and calls them over. They try to stick together, avoiding going under with the ship as it starts to rapidly increase its downward angle. Alma is begging Wennerström to hold on to one of her children, as both him and Karl-Olof try to hold on to the railing. The water comes up, rushing up on them, and he tries to hold on to the daughter, but he loses his grip. Alma and her daughters all perished, and the bodies were never found again. The ship is listing heavily around now, and a lot of people has already fallen down into the icy water. Tengling is suddenly reunited with Edvard and Elin Gerda Lindell, who he had met the previous night. They were part of a surge of passengers who stood on the boat deck in the ship's final moments. Suddenly, Tegnell spots a group of men getting collapsible A ready for a launch on the starboard side, and he and I believe Edward helps them loosen it from the roof. Collapsible A falls down, and suddenly the water comes rushing up. So the crew and a few passengers who is carrying pocket knives jumps on the boat and begin cutting the rope to the raft. But the water is rapidly moving the boat, and the water current causing everybody in the boat to be thrown off into the sea, tingling among them. This is the final moment before Titanic is lost forever. Meanwhile, Wennerström and Karl Olof and the others are now struggling up the sloping deck, trying to stay on the ship as long as possible. But it was too steep and slippery for them, and they all slid back down, close to collapsible A. The water was all around them, and the ship was slipping under. So Wennerström, Karl Olof and Lindell jumps into the water, trying to catch the collapsible A, who was near. As the water covers the boat deck and collapsible A has drifted off, Tingling clings to the raft as it floats away. As the ship went under, Wennerström, Karl Olof and Edward struggled in the cold water. They tried to pull themselves aboard collapsible A, which in turn was already taken in water. Wennerström saw Mrs. Elin Lindell in the water, and he grabbed her hand. Weakened by the cold, he was unable to assist her, but refused to let her go. He held her until her last breath, and then let her drift away. The wedding ring on her finger slid off her hand and ended up in the boat. Wennerström found it and gave it to Edward. Later, Wennerström stated that, quote, Edward's hair turned all grey in less than 30 minutes, end quote. Edward died soon after and lost Elin's wedding ring. He dropped it into the boat, and his body was lowered into the ocean to make the unstable boat lighter. Soon after, others tried to climb aboard collapsible A. Karl Olof fought them off. He later admitted to pushing others away from the raft to prevent it from going down due to excess weight. Quote, when I think of it, I can't understand how it could be saved, but my cold-bloodedness to push away the others from the raft so it could be kept on a sea level did much to it. It is awful, but in such a moment, the only question is your own life. End quote. The passengers who had survived the sinking, but were still in the water, were in every possible emotion of human fear. The crying from the people was the worst, but after about 20 minutes, the cries began to fade out, as the swimmers lapsed into unconsciousness and death. Not many people survived and got rescued from the water. Tingling is shoeless, and his feet are submerged in the freezing water inside the lifeboat. Dozens of people in collapsible A had died due to exposure of the freezing water and the cold temperature, and as they died, the corpses were thrown overboard. At 3:20 a.m., Lifeboat 14, helmed by 5th Officer Harold Lau, pulls alongside collapsible A, and from a dozen of people, only 13 survivors remained alive on the partially submerged raft. Lau takes them aboard and later testifies to the Senate's inquiry. Quote, another 3 minutes and they would have all been down. End quote. At 4 a.m., RMS Carpathia arrives at the Titanic site and began rescuing survivors. On May 13, 1912, the crew of RMS Oceanica, during westbound crossing, stumbles on collapsible A, adrift in the ocean near the Bermudas. The lifeboat still contained 3 bodies in a rotting state, but the most peculiar thing they found was a ring on the bottom of the lifeboat. After a long investigation, they found out that the ring belonged to Mrs. Elin Gerda Lindell. And in a long exchange of letters with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Swedish Consulate and the White Star Line, they identified the owner, and thus the ring went back to Sweden, to the nearest relative, her father Nils Persson. Out of all 100 plus Swedes on the ship, only 34 people survived the sinking of Titanic. May the memories of the Swedes on the Titanic serve as a reminder of our shared humanity, the fragility of life, and the power of hope.